There's a moment that feels almost unimaginable now. Every night at midnight, British television would simply stop. Not pause, not continue quietly in the background. Stop. The national anthem would play, the test card would appear, and that was it until morning. Just static and silence. This wasn't medieval history. This continued until the late 1980s. People accepted it as completely normal. British television has moments like this scattered through its history. Things that were standard practice, things nobody questioned, things that today would cause absolute outrage. We're going to look at 3 of them. None of these are conspiracy theories or urban legends. They're documented facts. Decisions made by real people for real reasons that made sense at the time. And they show us something uncomfortable about how quickly we accept what seems normal. Let's start with the nightly ritual that generations of British viewers lived with. Picture the routine. You're watching television. It's getting late. Around midnight, the programming ends. God Save the Queen starts playing. Many people would actually stand up in their own living rooms, out of habit or respect, or just because that's what you did. Then the image on screen would change to the test card, that girl with the clown toy playing noughts and crosses. A continuous tone would start. Beep. Just that tone. And if you fell asleep with the television on, that sound would drill into your skull until you woke up and switched it off. This wasn't just BBC One. All 3 channels shut down. BBC One, BBC Two, ITV. The entire British television universe went dark simultaneously. According to broadcasting records, this continued in various forms until the late 1980s. BBC One started 24-hour broadcasting in November 1997 during coverage of Princess Diana's funeral. That's 26 years ago. A single generation separates us from a time when television simply ended every night. The reasons seem almost quaint now. Broadcasting was expensive. Staff needed sleep. The assumption was that normal people should be in bed by midnight anyway. Television was there to serve society's schedule, not the other way around. If you worked night shifts, or suffered from insomnia, or just preferred staying up late, you were out of luck. The idea that viewers might want choice about when to watch didn't factor into the decision. The BBC operated under a public service mandate. Public service meant deciding what was good for the public. And being awake at 2 a.m. watching television apparently wasn't good for anyone. There's something else worth considering. The closedown reinforced a particular vision of British society. Orderly, disciplined, everyone following the same schedule. You worked during the day. You watched television in the evening. You went to bed at a reasonable hour. The system didn't accommodate people whose lives didn't fit that pattern. Shift workers, insomniacs, anyone whose circumstances or preferences differed from the assumed norm. The closedown was a nightly reminder that broadcasting served the mainstream. Everyone else could adjust or do without. When closedowns finally ended, it wasn't because of public demand. It was economics. The technology existed to broadcast overnight. The costs had dropped. Filling those hours with cheap programming made financial sense. But for decades, the infrastructure existed to broadcast 24 hours. The decision not to was cultural. It reflected assumptions about what television was for and who it served. Those assumptions felt completely natural to everyone living with them. Looking back, they seem bizarre. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What are we accepting as natural now that future generations will find equally strange? On October 19, 1988, Home Secretary Douglas Hurd issued a notice to British broadcasters. Representatives of certain Irish Republican and Loyalist organisations could no longer have their voices broadcast, their actual voices. You could show them speaking, you could report their words, you could subtitle what they said, but you couldn't broadcast the sound of their voices. This wasn't secret. It was official government policy, announced in the House of Commons. The ban targeted 11 organisations: Sinn Féin, the IRA, the INLA, the UDA, the UVF, others. Anyone representing or supporting these groups couldn't speak directly to British audiences. Gerry Adams was a sitting member of Parliament. Martin McGuinness was a prominent political figure. Both were banned from having their voices heard. So broadcasters hired actors. They would watch the person speaking and dub their words in real time. Sometimes they'd try to match the tone and emotion. Sometimes they'd deliberately keep it flat and neutral. Either way, British viewers watched politicians speak but heard someone else's voice. The absurdity became clear quickly. Documentary maker Peter Taylor interviewed IRA prisoners in the Maze prison. One prisoner started complaining about the quality of the sausage rolls. By the letter of the law, Taylor had to switch to an actor's voice for that complaint. An armed paramilitary member criticizing institutional catering had his voice replaced by an actor. The broadcaster followed the rules precisely. The result was farcical. When Gerry Adams visited the United States in 1994, his speech was broadcast around the world. In Britain, viewers watched him speak while hearing an actor's voice. International audiences heard Adams directly. British audiences heard a performance. Journalists hated it. The National Union of Journalists challenged the ban in court in May 1994. They lost. The European Commission of Human Rights rejected their case. Similar challenges in Ireland had also failed. BBC staff had staged a one-day strike back in 1985 when the government blocked a documentary featuring Martin McGuinness and Gregory Campbell. The union saw it as censorship. The government called it denying terrorists the oxygen of publicity. Margaret Thatcher's phrase. The oxygen of publicity. As if ideas spread like fire and cutting off access to media would smother them. The policy created problems British journalists hadn't anticipated. BBC Foreign Affairs editor John Simpson was working in Baghdad during the Gulf War. Iraqi officials would bring up the British voice ban when he complained about their censorship. He later said he didn't like seeing Britain on the same side as Saddam Hussein on anything. Correspondents working in India and Egypt faced similar challenges. How do you criticize authoritarian censorship when your own government practices it? The ban damaged Britain's international reputation as a defender of press freedom. It gave dictatorships a talking point they used enthusiastically. Did it work? Research showed Sinn Féin appearances on television dropped 63% between 1988 and 1989. But violence didn't decrease. The IRA continued operations. Sinn Féin's political support didn't collapse. Academic analysis suggests the ban had no measurable effect on the conflict's trajectory. What it did do was normalize censorship. For 6 years, British broadcasters operated under government restrictions on political speech. They found workarounds. They adapted. And after a while, most people stopped noticing anything unusual about watching politicians speak with borrowed voices. The ban ended September 16, 1994. 2 weeks after the IRA declared a ceasefire, John Major lifted it, saying Sinn Féin could now use their own words. Michael Grade called it one of the most embarrassing attempts to censor coverage of the most important domestic political story of the post-war years. John Burt said they could finally apply normal scrutiny to all sides. But here's what stays with me. For 6 years, this was normal. Broadcasters complied. Audiences accepted it. The machinery of censorship operated smoothly because everyone involved made it work. The ban didn't fail because people refused to follow it. It ended because the political situation changed. That's worth thinking about. Between 1967 and 1978, the BBC systematically destroyed large portions of its own archive. Thousands of hours of programming were wiped or burned. Doctor Who lost 97 episodes, still missing today. Top of the Pops lost 514 editions. Jukebox Jury kept 2 episodes out of 432. This wasn't accidental. It was policy. The BBC engineering department owned the videotapes. Production departments rented them. After broadcast, the tapes went back to engineering, and engineering wiped them clean for reuse. The math was simple. Videotape cost roughly the same as a mini car. Storage space wasn't infinite. The engineering department's job was managing equipment, not preserving culture. And there seemed no reason to keep old programs. Copyright restrictions limited repeats. Equity, the actors' union, worried that videotape would reduce work by making repeats easier. Union agreements capped how many times and when programs could be repeated. The compensation fees were deliberately set so high that making new programming was cheaper than repeating old content. Nobody imagined these programs might have value decades later. The BBC also created 16mm film copies for overseas sales. These telerecordings would be sent to broadcasters in Australia or Nigeria or Hong Kong. After the contract expired, BBC enterprises would either collect them back or instruct the foreign station to destroy them. Either way, most disappeared. Many came back stamped with a certificate of destruction and were incinerated. Space was limited. Black and white programming seemed obsolete in the era of color television. Who would want to watch old shows anyway? So they burned them. Perfectly preserved copies of programs that had cost substantial money to produce were treated as worthless. Sue Malden started working at the BBC as an assistant researcher in the early 1970s. She assumed the BBC's television history was preserved somewhere, neatly organized, available for research. What she found were gaps, huge gaps. Many things just weren't there. She later became Television Archive Selector in 1979. By then, the scale of loss was becoming clear. The first Doctor Who videotapes were wiped in March 1967, just 2 months after Episode 4 of The Highlanders first aired. The serial had barely finished transmitting before it started being erased. Current estimates suggest 60 to 70% of all BBC programming produced between the mid-1950s and mid-1970s was deleted. 60 to 70%. Think about that for a moment. More than half of 2 decades of British cultural output was deliberately destroyed by the institution that created it. Not lost to fire or flood or war. Systematically erased as a matter of routine policy. And at the time, this seemed completely reasonable. Dick Fiddy from the British Film Institute put it well. Had they kept those tapes, and newspapers found out they were sitting on thousands of hours they couldn't show, they'd be accused of wasting public money. What they did was good housekeeping. The wiping officially ended in 1978. Home video was emerging as a market. Attitudes were shifting towards seeing archive programming as historically and culturally valuable. The BBC Film Library became the Film and Videotape Library. Preservation became part of their mandate. But the damage was done. Since then, efforts have recovered some material. Episodes found in overseas television stations that ignored destruction orders. Material discovered in private collections. 9 Doctor Who episodes were found in Nigeria in 2013, just sitting in a storage room gathering dust. The search continues, but 97 Doctor Who episodes remain missing, presumed destroyed forever. Here's what disturbs me about this story. The BBC wasn't acting maliciously. They were making rational decisions based on the economics and culture of their time. Television wasn't considered an art form worth preserving. It was considered ephemeral entertainment. Videotape was expensive. Storage was limited. Nobody predicted home video or digital streaming, or the idea that old television might have commercial value. The decisions made sense within their context, which means they show us how easily institutions can destroy their own history while believing they're being sensible and practical. 3 moments in British television history. Nightly closedowns that continued into the 1990s. A 6-year voice ban that made journalists use actors to dub political speech. And the systematic destruction of 60 to 70% of the BBC's output from 2 decades. None of these were secrets. None were controversial at the time. They were normal, standard practice, the way things worked. Today, we have the opposite problems. Television never stops. Every channel broadcasts 24 hours. Streaming services offer unlimited archives. Politicians speak directly to audiences through social media, bypassing traditional broadcasters entirely. And everything gets preserved. Every tweet, every video, every embarrassing moment. The problem isn't access, it's abundance. We're drowning in content with no reliable way to sort valuable from worthless. But look closer and you'll find new forms of control. Algorithms decide what you see. Platforms can ban accounts or remove content instantly. Copyright systems automatically block material. These controls are less visible than test cards or voice bans or destroyed archives. They're technical rather than political, but they're still decisions about what gets broadcast and preserved, made by institutions following their own logic, seeming completely normal to everyone operating within the system. The interesting question isn't whether past broadcasting practices were right or wrong. It's how easily they were accepted as normal. People stood for the national anthem in their own homes because that's what you did. Viewers watched politicians speak with dubbed voices and after a while barely noticed. The BBC burned thousands of hours of programming and called it good housekeeping. None of this required force. It required everyone involved agreeing that this was how things worked. Which brings us back to where we started. What are we accepting as normal now that will seem insane to future generations? What practices feel so natural that we don't even notice them as choices? The closedowns ended, the voice ban lifted, archive policy changed. Not because someone suddenly realized they were wrong, because circumstances changed enough that maintaining them became impractical or embarrassing. The systems adapted, new norms emerged, and eventually became just as invisible as the old ones. Television history shows us this pattern repeating. Control that seems necessary until it doesn't. Destruction that seems practical until it's regretted. Censorship that seems justified until political circumstances shift. The technology changes, the specific practices change, but the underlying dynamic remains. Institutions make decisions that serve their interests. Those decisions get normalized through repetition, and everyone operating within the system accepts them as simply how things are, until they aren't.